Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to look at August von Finck Sr. He's sometimes called Hitler's banker, which I have to admit is a pretty intriguing title. So we're mainly using his Wikipedia entry for this one. And it's a pretty fascinating read, although a little bit unsettling at times, too. He was really tied up with the Nazi regime, it seems. But he also tried to say he wasn't later on. It's complicated, for sure. So to help us try to figure this guy out, we have an expert on German finances during that time. Welcome. So maybe you could start us off by telling us what kind of world this guy was born into.
Well, you have to imagine Germany right at the very beginning of the 20th century. That's when August von Finck Sr. was born, 1898. And right from the start, his family was already super involved in finance. His dad, Wilhelm von Finks, he founded Allianz, the insurance company, and also the Merck Fink & Co. Bank. I mean, this wasn't just being rich. It was a whole financial empire just waiting for him.
Yeah, talking about being born with a silver spoon. So all that privilege, I mean, did it affect the path he ended up taking?
Well, it's really hard to know for sure. But think about this. Not only did he inherit the banking business, but he also got tons of land. I mean, huge amounts. And that kind of thing. It really instills a certain worldview, like a sense that there's a social hierarchy and you have to protect your place at the top. It's interesting because later on after the war, he was totally against land reform. It's like he really believed in a certain order and thought it was his duty to keep things that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. His Wikipedia entry also mentioned that his brother died in World War I. I mentioned losing his brother on top of having all that responsibility suddenly thrust on him. That had a big impact.
Oh, absolutely. Losing his brother in the Great War like that, it definitely shaped how he saw the world. And then having to lead those family businesses during such a crazy time, I mean, it probably made him even more ruthless than he already was. Like, he had to secure his position no matter what, especially with the world feeling so unstable.
And then you have the whole mess of the Weimar Republic, all that instability. I mean, did that play into his story too?
Definitely. All the economic problems and the politics being so uncertain, it created the perfect conditions for these extreme ideologies to take hold, like Nazism. And this is when von Finck first met Hitler, 1931.
Okay, so now things are getting really interesting. Tell me about this meeting.
Okay, so picture this. The Hotel Kaiserhof in Berlin, von Finck is there with a bunch of other really important industrialists, and they're meeting with Hitler. They're all freaked out about communism, and they see Hitler as the answer. Like, he's the only one who can stop it. Von Finck and another guy, they even promised to give Hitler 5 million Reichsmark to support the SA. That was Hitler's paramilitary group. They said they'd give him the money if there was a leftist uprising.
Whoa, so they were basically ready to fund a coup.
Pretty much, yeah. The uprising never happened, so they never actually had to pay up. But just the fact that they were willing to make that promise, it shows you where their loyalties were. They thought Hitler was the lesser of two evils, like the only way to protect their own money and power with everything so chaotic.
Wow. So then von Finck officially joins the Nazi Party pretty soon after that.
Yep. May 1933, just a few months after Hitler takes over. Von Finck gets his Nazi Party membership card.
So it wasn't just like he was going along with the new government. It was like he chose to be a part of it.
Exactly. And for von Finck, joining the Nazis wasn't just about politics. It was a business decision. He saw a chance to make even more money under Hitler and to get even more powerful, too.
That's disturbing.
Yep.
So how did he use his position to get ahead under the Nazis?
Well, one example is this museum, the Haus der Kunstmuseum. It was one of Hitler's pet projects. It was supposed to show off what the Nazis thought was great German art.
It was propaganda, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. And von Finck was one of the main guys raising money for it, so he used his money to support the regime's cultural agenda. It's kind of creepy when you think about how art can be used for political reasons like that.
Right. Wasn't he also involved in taking over Jewish businesses?
Yeah, unfortunately. The Nazis called it Aryanization, which is a really messed up way to say they were stealing Jewish businesses and all their assets. And von Finck's bank, Merck Fink & Co., they were totally involved. They got these businesses for way less than they were worth, all thanks to the Nazis' discrimination.
His Wikipedia entry specifically mentions the Rothschild Bank in Vienna.
Right. That's a perfect example. The Rothschild Bank was a huge deal. And when Merck Fink & Co. got it, it made them one of the most important banks in Europe. But it was all built on basically ruining Jewish families.
It's awful to think about, all those people losing their jobs, their homes, their dignity. And von Finck is just getting richer and more powerful.
Yeah, and if you read his own words, you can see how much he was a part of it. There's a letter he wrote in 1937, and he talks about needing to cleanse the banking industry of Jewish influence. Like, it was a good thing, something he wanted to profit from.
Wow. It's hard to believe how much suffering went into making him successful.
Yeah. And it's important to remember that von Finck wasn't the only one. There were a lot of people who benefited from the Nazis and who helped make those horrible things happen. If we want to really understand this dark period, we need to look at these individual stories, these choices people made even in the face of something so terrible.
That's true. And this is just the first part of his story. After the war, how did he deal with everything that happened? And what about denazification? We'll find out in the next part of our deep dive.
After the war, things were really different for Germany. I mean, especially for people who were connected to the Nazi regime. And for someone like August von Finck Sr., it was all about damage control.
Well,
You know, he had to protect all his money and his reputation with denazification going on.
yeah, so how does somebody like him, someone who was so involved with the Nazis, how do they deal with that? Did he face any consequences?
Well, instead of admitting what he did, he tried to say he had nothing to do with the Nazis. He claimed he wasn't really political, even that he was against them. He wanted to make it seem like he was a victim, not someone who actually supported the regime.
A victim? That's hard to believe when you consider how much he did to support their policies.
Yeah, it does sound kind of crazy, right? But you got to remember, it was a total mess back then. People were rewriting their stories left and right, trying to downplay their Nazi involvement and blame other people. Everybody was just trying to save themselves. And von Finck was really good at it.
His Wikipedia entry mentions something called Perselschein. What is that?
Oh, Perselschein. It basically means whitewash certificate. It was a document that people used to say they were innocent, or that they didn't really do anything with the Nazis. Usually important people would give them out. It was a way for people to clear their names, or get lighter punishments during the denazification trials.
So they were a way to avoid being held accountable.
You could definitely say that. They were super controversial because a lot of people who actually did bad things, they used Perselschein to get away with it, and von Finck was no exception. He gave the court something like 40 of those things.
40. It sounds like he was trying everything he could to get out of any real trouble.
Oh yeah, he was determined. And besides the Perselschein, he used his money and his connections to manipulate the whole legal system. He spent tons of money to make sure witnesses who could hurt him didn't show up in court, or that they changed their stories. There are even stories that he might have blackmailed the prosecutor.
Wow, he was willing to do anything to protect himself. So what happened in the end? Did he actually escape justice?
Well, even with all the evidence against him, he
Yeah.
managed to avoid any serious punishment. In 1948, he was labeled as a fellow traveler, which was a pretty minor category in the whole denazification system. All he got was a small fine.
A small fine. For someone who made so much money because of the Nazis, that doesn't seem like much of a punishment. Did the denazification process fail in his case?
It's complicated. The Allies had this huge job trying to rebuild Germany, and at the same time, they had to hold people accountable for the Nazi crimes. It was a massive undertaking, and it wasn't perfect. Some people thought they were too lenient, like they let former Nazis just go back to their lives without real consequences. Others said that they had to be practical to rebuild the country, even if it meant some people got away with things.
It sounded like figuring out justice in post-war Germany was a real dilemma.
It definitely was, and von Finck's case shows how messy it all was. Even though he was just a fellow traveler, he still kept most of his wealth and influence. And after being banned from banking for 5 years, he went right back to building his financial empire.
That's crazy. So it seems like he just picked up where he left off. What was he focused on after the war?
Well, aside from all the banking stuff, he was totally against land reform. Remember all that land he inherited? He was super protective of it. He saw land reform as this huge threat to his money and status.
It's like he didn't learn anything from the war or all the suffering he caused. All he cared about was getting richer and more powerful. It's like he didn't even think about what was right and wrong.
A lot of people feel that way about him. His story really makes you question the connection between money, power, and morality. It seems like he always put his own interests first, even when it meant supporting something truly awful.
It makes you wonder if anything has really changed.
Yeah. We still see people using wealth and power to avoid being held accountable. It's a pattern that keeps repeating throughout history, and it's something societies still struggle with today.
So true. Speaking of recurring themes, his Wikipedia entry mentions that he bought Weinfelden Castle in 1972. Is there something special about that castle?
Well, Weinfelden Castle is this really impressive estate. But what makes it interesting in von Finck's story is the irony. Before the war, it belonged to a Jewish family, but they were forced to sell it during the Nazi era, probably because of all the pressure and threats.
Oh, well. So the same guy who profited from taking over Jewish businesses ends up owning a castle that was taken from a Jewish family. That's a pretty tragic twist. It shows how long the effects of injustice can last.
It definitely adds another layer to his story. The past is never really gone. It keeps shaping the present in ways we might not even realize. Von Finck buying Weinfelden Castle. It's a powerful reminder of that. It shows how injustice can have a lasting impact and how complicated history can be.
We've covered a lot about August von Finck Sr. today. His privileged upbringing, his involvement with the Nazis, how he tried to avoid responsibility after the war, and how he eventually got his wealth and power back. But how should we remember him? What's his legacy?
That's a tough question. There's no easy answer. His story reminds us of the bad side of human nature, how power can corrupt people and how dangerous greed can be. But it also makes us think about how strong institutions can be, how hard it is to achieve justice in history, and how the past continues to affect us today.
It's definitely a story that leaves us with more questions than answers. And maybe that's the point. It challenges us to face some uncomfortable truths
Exactly.
and to think about the impact of the choices we make, both as individuals and as a society.
I think that's a good place to leave it for today.
This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us.
You're welcome.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into such a complicated and disturbing part of history. Remember, this isn't the end of the story. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep challenging the narratives that shape our world. We'll see you next time. Man, when you hear a story like August von Finck Sr.'s, it really makes you think, from that privileged life he was born into, to getting so mixed up with the Nazis,
Yeah.
and then trying to pretend it never happened after the war. It's a lot to process.
Yeah, it really is. And it just goes to show how much impact one person's choices can have. It's not just about him and what he did. It's about how his actions affected so many other people, even generations later.
It also makes you wonder about responsibility, especially when you have money and power. Like, he clearly put his own interests first, even when it meant going along with something so horrible.
Yeah, that's something we see over and over again throughout history. When people care more about money and staying safe than doing what's right, it can corrupt everything. And looking at stories like Von Finck's helps us see how those patterns work and how they play out in the bigger picture.
It makes you wonder, are things any different now? Do we still see people using wealth and power to avoid being held accountable?
Unfortunately, yeah, it's a problem. Societies are still trying to figure out, how do we make sure justice is served, that history is told truthfully, and that we learn from the past? These are questions we always need to be asking ourselves.
It can feel kind of overwhelming when you think about it all. But you're right. Knowing more is important. That's how we can make a difference.
Exactly. And when we know more, we have a responsibility to do something about it. Don't be afraid to question things, to challenge what people tell you, and to speak up when you see injustice happening. Von Finck's story shows us how dangerous it can be to stay silent. We all have a part to play in making the world a better place.
That's a great point. So what can we do? What actions can we take after hearing a story like this?
I think the most important thing is to stay involved. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep talking about these things. Read books, watch documentaries, go to museums, talk to people who have different views. The more we understand about the past, the better we can deal with the present and create a better future.
Yeah, it's easy to get discouraged, but knowledge is power. And with knowledge comes responsibility.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening conversation. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing your expertise with us.
It was my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into such a complicated and disturbing part of history. But remember, this isn't the end. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep challenging the stories that shape our world. We'll see you next time.